From a child actor named James Bond who vanished after making one masterpiece, to Lloyd Kaufman taking over cinematography duties, to a lead actress who became a best-selling novelist and civil rights counselor, the 1990 horror cult classic Death by Temptation harbors secrets more bizarre than its blood-soaked succubus story. This Troma-distributed oddity featured future superstars, recycled monster suits, visible wire mistakes, and a filming location owned by Laurence Fishburne, creating one of cinema's most unexpectedly fascinating behind-the-scenes tales. Fact 1. The director's real name was James Bond. When audiences first encountered Death by Temptation in 1990, many assumed the director's credit was some kind of clever pseudonym or marketing gimmick. After all, what are the odds that someone named James Bond would end up making movies? But James Bond III was indeed his real name. And the story behind it makes this coincidence even more remarkable. Born James Bond III in 1966, he carried on a family tradition that stretched back through two previous generations. His grandfather, James Bond Sr., and his father, James Bond Jr., had both borne the famous name long before Ian Fleming created the fictional secret agent. The Bond family had no connection to the spy novels or films, they simply happened to share one of the most recognizable names in popular culture. What makes this fact particularly poignant is the timing of the film's dedication. Death by Temptation includes a heartfelt tribute at the end of the credits to both James Bond Sr. and James Bond Jr., who had passed away in 1982 and 1979 respectively. This means that by the time James Bond III was making his directorial debut, he was the sole surviving member of his James Bond lineage. The young filmmaker had grown up as a child actor, appearing in television shows like The Red Hand Gang, The Love Boat, and Wonder Woman throughout the 1970s and early 80s. When he decided to step behind the camera for Death by Temptation, he was carrying not just his own artistic ambitions, but also the weight of a family name that had become synonymous with action and adventure in the minds of moviegoers worldwide. The fact that someone literally named James Bond would create a horror film about supernatural temptation and religious faith, rather than spy thrillers, adds an unexpected layer of irony to an already unusual Hollywood story. Fact 2. It was made by a vanishing one-hit wonder. When Death by Temptation premiered in 1990, film critics immediately recognized James Bond III as a major new talent worth watching. The New York Times compared him directly to Spike Lee, while the Washington Post drew parallels with acclaimed director Kathryn Bigelow, suggesting that Bond had the potential to become one of the most important filmmakers of his generation. However, instead of launching a successful career, this supernatural horror film became the first and last directorial effort from one of cinema's most puzzling vanishing acts. Despite the critical praise and the film's cult following, Bond completely disappeared from behind the camera after Death by Temptation, never writing or directing another feature film in the more than 30 years that have passed since its release. This absence becomes even more mysterious when considering that the film demonstrated genuine artistic vision, featured impressive cinematography from Ernest Dickerson, and proved that Bond could work effectively with established actors while managing complex production challenges. Bond's retreat from filmmaking represents one of the entertainment industry's most intriguing unsolved mysteries, especially since he had already proven himself capable of creating compelling cinema that found both critical and audience appreciation. Unlike many one-time directors whose single efforts failed commercially or artistically, Bond walked away from what appeared to be a promising career trajectory with no clear explanation for his decision. In recent years, Bond has occasionally surfaced on social media with cryptic posts suggesting he might return to filmmaking, including a Facebook banner that claimed he's back, with promises of more clues coming. However, these hints have never materialized into actual projects, leaving fans to wonder what might have been if this talented filmmaker had continued making movies instead of becoming one of Hollywood's most enigmatic disappearing acts. Fact 3. Lloyd Kaufman had to become emergency cinematographer. Most people know Lloyd Kaufman as the eccentric founder of Troma Entertainment, the studio behind cult classics like The Toxic Avenger and Class of Nukem High. What they don't know is that he once had to grab a camera and become an emergency cinematographer for one of his most prestigious releases, despite having absolutely no experience behind the lens. The situation arose during post-production of Death by Temptation when James Bond III realized he needed additional footage to complete his vision for the film's climactic scenes. The main cinematography had been handled by Ernest Dickerson, who was already establishing himself as one of the most talented visual artists in cinema through his work on Spike Lee's films. Dickerson had wrapped his portion of the shoot and moved on to other projects, leaving Bond in a difficult position. Enter Lloyd Kaufman, who had come aboard late in the production to provide finishing funds for the independent film. When Bond explained that he needed someone to shoot the additional sequences, Kaufman found himself volunteered for a job he had never done before. In interviews years later, Kaufman admitted he was genuinely nervous about taking on cinematography duties, knowing that his footage would need to match the professional quality that Dickerson had established for the rest of the film. The scenes that Kaufman shot included some of the movie's most important climactic moments, where the supernatural elements of the story reached their peak. Despite his lack of technical training, Kaufman managed to capture the additional footage that Bond needed to complete his debut feature. The fact that these crucial scenes were shot by a nervous studio executive with no cinematography background makes the final product even more remarkable, especially considering that audiences watching the finished film would never suspect such behind-the-scenes improvisation had taken place. Fact 4. The monster suit was recycled from another Troma film. When the succubus finally reveals her true demonic form in the climactic scenes of Death by Temptation, audiences witness what appears to be a uniquely designed monster costume created specifically for this supernatural horror story. However, sharp-eyed Troma fans might recognize something familiar about the creature's appearance, and they would be absolutely right to trust their instincts. The monster suit used for the Temptress's final transformation was actually recycled from another Troma production called Sergeant Kabukiman New York Police Department, which featured a clumsy police officer who gains supernatural Japanese kabuki powers and becomes a crime-fighting superhero. This costume sharing perfectly exemplifies Troma Entertainment's legendary approach to filmmaking, where props, effects, and even entire scenes are reused across multiple productions to stretch every dollar as far as possible. Troma's founder Lloyd Kaufman has never been shy about admitting his studio's cost-cutting methods, often describing them as essential survival tactics for independent filmmakers working with minimal budgets. The company became famous for reusing everything from severed limbs to exploding cars across different movies, turning their frugal approach into a distinctive trademark that fans came to expect and even appreciate. The recycling of the monster suit happened during the additional shooting phase, when Kaufman himself was behind the camera, trying to capture the final supernatural sequences that James Bond III needed to complete his film. Rather than spend money creating an entirely new creature costume, the practical decision was made to repurpose the existing suit from the Kabukiman project. This prop sharing represents more than just budget consciousness. It became part of Troma's unique cinematic universe, where elements from one film could unexpectedly appear in another, creating an interconnected world of B-movie horror and comedy that devoted fans learned to watch for and celebrate. Fact 5. It was filmed at Laurence Fishburne's house. When viewers watch the interior scenes of Death by Temptation, they're actually getting a glimpse inside the real home of one of Hollywood's most respected actors, though he never appears in the film itself. The house where much of the movie was shot belonged to Laurence Fishburne, who would later become famous for roles in the Matrix trilogy and Boys in the Hood, but was already making a name for himself in serious dramatic films. The connection between Fishburne and this low-budget horror production came through his marriage to Hajna Moss, who served as one of the producers on Death by Temptation. This personal relationship provided James Bond III and his crew with access to a legitimate residential location that would have otherwise been far beyond their modest budget constraints. Using someone's actual home as a filming location is always a significant favor, especially when that someone is a working actor whose career was steadily rising in Hollywood. At the time of filming in 1989, Fishburne had already established himself through his work in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, and was building the reputation that would soon lead to his breakthrough role in John Singleton's Boys in the Hood the following year. His willingness to let an independent horror film take over his personal living space demonstrates the kind of support that emerging filmmakers often need from established industry connections. The house itself becomes an important character in the movie, serving as the primary location where the supernatural events unfold and where the main characters confront the demonic forces threatening them. Without Fishburne's generosity in providing this location, the production would have faced significant challenges in finding an appropriate setting that could accommodate their filming needs while staying within their tight financial constraints. Fact 6. The lead actress became a best-selling author. Cynthia Bond delivered such a mesmerizing performance as the seductive and terrifying succubus in Death by Temptation that many viewers assumed she would go on to become a major horror film star. Instead, Bond chose a completely different path that led her away from Hollywood and toward a career dedicated to helping others and creating literature that would eventually reach millions of readers worldwide. After appearing in just a handful of acting projects through the mid-1990s, including a role in the film Higher Education, Bond made the decision to leave the entertainment industry entirely. Rather than pursuing more acting opportunities, she became a counselor working with some of society's most vulnerable populations, specifically focusing on homeless and at-risk youth from the LGBTQ community at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. For over 15 years, she dedicated herself to this work, using her creativity and compassion to help young people who had often been rejected by their families and communities. During her years as a counselor, Bond began channeling her experiences and the stories she encountered into writing. She spent 10 years crafting a novel called Ruby, which drew inspiration from both her family history and the lives of the young people she had worked with. The book explored themes of trauma, survival, and healing in ways that resonated deeply with readers and critics alike. In 2014, Ruby was selected for Oprah's Book Club 2.0, catapulting Bond from relative obscurity to literary fame. The novel spent 6 consecutive weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and earned praise for its unflinching examination of difficult subjects, combined with elements of magical realism. Bond also founded the Blackbird Collective in 2011, an organization dedicated to creating supportive environments for writers, particularly those telling stories that are often overlooked or silenced. Fact 7. You can see the special effects strings. One of the most charming aspects of low-budget filmmaking is how technical limitations sometimes create unintentionally memorable moments, and Death by Temptation provides a perfect example during one of its most seductive scenes. When the succubus is demonstrating her supernatural powers by magically putting on her stockings, viewers with keen eyes can actually see the thin strings that were used to create this otherworldly effect. The scene occurs during one of the film's more intimate moments, when the temptress is preparing herself and using her demonic abilities to dress without physically touching her clothing. The filmmakers intended this to be a subtle display of her supernatural nature, showing that she could manipulate objects through pure mystical power. However, the practical reality of creating this effect on a tight budget meant relying on nearly invisible fishing line or similar materials to move the stockings up her legs. Unfortunately for the special effects team, the lighting conditions and camera angles made these strings just visible enough that attentive audiences could spot them if they knew what to look for. This type of technical mishap was fairly common in independent horror films of the era, where ambitious visual ideas often exceeded the available resources and time needed to execute them flawlessly. Rather than being a major distraction, these visible strings have become part of the film's charm for many fans who appreciate the earnest effort that went into creating supernatural effects with minimal resources. The mistake serves as a reminder of the creative problem-solving that independent filmmakers must employ when trying to bring their visions to life without studio-level budgets. This particular effects error has been noted by multiple viewers over the years and even appears in the film's trivia sections on various movie databases, cementing its place as one of those endearing production quirks that fans of B-movies and cult cinema have learned to embrace rather than criticize. Fact 8. It predates famous black cinema landmarks. While film historians often point to the early 1990s as the beginning of the modern black independent cinema movement, Death by Temptation actually arrived on the scene before the movies that are typically credited with launching this cultural renaissance. The film was completed and released a full month ahead of Matty Rich's highly acclaimed Straight Outta Brooklyn, and arrived a complete year before John Singleton's groundbreaking Boys in the Hood hit theaters and changed Hollywood forever. This timing makes James Bond III's supernatural horror film an unrecognized pioneer of what would become one of the most important periods in American cinema. While Spike Lee had already established himself as a major force with films like She's Gotta Have It and Do the Right Thing in the late 1980s, the early 1990s saw an explosion of young black filmmakers breaking into the industry with personal, low-budget productions that told stories from perspectives that had been largely absent from mainstream cinema. Death by Temptation represented something unique within this emerging movement because it chose to work within the horror genre rather than focusing on urban drama or social realism like many of its contemporaries. The film demonstrated that Black independent cinema could successfully explore supernatural themes and genre filmmaking while still maintaining cultural authenticity and artistic integrity. The movie's early position in this timeline becomes even more significant when considering that it was distributed by Troma Entertainment, a company known primarily for campy B-movies and exploitation films. This meant that Death by Temptation was pioneering Black independent cinema within a distribution system that was completely outside the traditional Hollywood structure, proving that innovative storytelling could find audiences through alternative channels long before the industry mainstream recognized the commercial and artistic value of diverse voices in filmmaking. Fact 9. Samuel L. Jackson's role was wildly oversold. Anyone who picked up promotional materials for Death by Temptation would have every reason to expect Samuel L. Jackson to play a major role in the film, given that his name appeared prominently in the credits and his face was featured on movie posters and video covers. However, viewers who rented or purchased the movie based on Jackson's involvement were in for a significant surprise when they discovered just how limited his actual screen time turned out to be. Jackson appears in only a handful of brief scenes as Minister Garth, the father of the main character Joel, and his total presence in the film amounts to maybe 5 or 10 minutes at most. His character serves an important narrative function by establishing Joel's religious background and family history, but Jackson essentially plays a supporting role that could easily be missed if someone stepped away from the screen at the wrong moment. This misleading marketing becomes even more problematic when considering that 1990 was a breakthrough year for Jackson, who appeared in 10 different films including major releases like Goodfellas, The Exorcist III, and Mo Better Blues. Audiences were beginning to recognize Jackson as a rising talent, making his name valuable for promotional purposes, even though his role in Death by Temptation was relatively small. The situation was made worse by Troma Entertainment founder Lloyd Kaufman, who incorrectly claimed in promotional materials that this was Jackson's debut acting performance. This statement was completely false, as Jackson had already appeared in numerous films including Coming to America, School Days, Do the Right Thing, and Sea of Love before Death by Temptation was even made. The overselling of Jackson's involvement represents a classic example of how independent film marketing often promises more star power than the actual movie delivers, leaving audiences feeling somewhat deceived about what they were purchasing. Fact 10. The bar location has mysteriously disappeared. One of the most atmospheric locations in Death by Temptation was Two Steps Down, a real bar and soul food restaurant in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, that served as the primary meeting place where the succubus hunted for her victims. This wasn't just a movie set built for the production, it was an actual neighborhood establishment that had been serving the local community since 1969, making it a genuine piece of Brooklyn history that happened to become part of horror movie lore. Two Steps Down was located on DeKalb Avenue and had earned a reputation as what many people called a true neighborhood institution. When owner Yvette Mayo first opened the establishment, there were hardly any other restaurants in the surrounding area, making it a pioneering business that helped establish Fort Greene as a dining destination. Over the years, Mayo's daughters Renee and Rhonda took over operations and continued the family tradition of serving both food and drinks to local residents and visitors. The bar's authentic atmosphere and lived-in character made it perfect for the gritty, neon-soaked aesthetic that director James Bond III and cinematographer Ernest Dickerson wanted to create for their supernatural story. The location provided exactly the kind of urban authenticity that independent filmmakers often struggle to find within their limited budgets, and using a real neighborhood bar added genuine texture to the film's portrayal of New York City nightlife. However, film fans who might want to visit this piece of cinema history today would be disappointed to discover that Two Steps Down appears to have become a casualty of the economic disruption caused by the pandemic. Local residents have reported that the establishment seemed to be undergoing some kind of renovation work, but has remained completely closed for an extended period, with no clear indication of whether it will ever reopen or if this Brooklyn institution has permanently disappeared. Fact 11. It was mistakenly marketed as a sequel. International movie marketing has produced some legendary mistakes over the years, but few are as blatantly misleading as what happened when Death by Temptation finally reached Swedish audiences in 1997. Despite being made 5 full years before Eddie Murphy's Vampire in Brooklyn hit theaters in 1995, the Swedish distributors somehow decided to promote James Bond III's film as if it were a sequel to Murphy's vampire comedy. This bizarre marketing decision was based entirely on superficial similarities between the two completely unrelated films. Both movies featured African-American characters dealing with vampires in New York City settings, and apparently that was enough for the Swedish marketing team to assume audiences would accept one as a follow-up to the other. The fact that Death by Temptation was actually made first had a completely different tone and shared no cast members or creative personnel with Murphy's film seemed irrelevant to whoever was responsible for this promotional strategy. The confusion was compounded by the fact that Death by Temptation was released as a direct-to-video title in Sweden, arriving 2 years after Vampire in Brooklyn had already played in Swedish theaters. This timing made it seem plausible to casual consumers that the James Bond III film could indeed be some kind of sequel or spin-off, especially if they were not familiar with the actual production dates of either movie. Swedish horror fans who rented or purchased Death by Temptation, expecting to see a continuation of Eddie Murphy's vampire character, were undoubtedly surprised to discover they were watching a completely different story with an entirely different cast, tone, and approach to supernatural horror. This marketing deception represents one of the more creative examples of international distributors trying to capitalize on name recognition, regardless of whether any actual connection existed between the films being promoted. Fact 12. The cast was a school days reunion. When James Bond III was putting together the cast for Death by Temptation, he had a significant advantage that most first-time directors could never dream of having. He had already worked alongside some talented actors on a major Spike Lee production just 2 years earlier. Bond had appeared in Lee's 1988 musical School Days as the character Monroe, and his experience on that set gave him direct access to several performers who would become key players in his horror debut. The most prominent School Days alumni that Bond recruited was Kadeem Hardison, who played the central role of Kay, Joel's childhood friend and struggling actor. Hardison had been one of the standout performers in Lee's college set musical, and was simultaneously becoming a household name through his starring role on the television series A Different World. His involvement in Death by Temptation gave the independent horror film immediate credibility and star power that would have been impossible to secure otherwise. Bond also brought in Samuel L. Jackson and Bill Nunn, both of whom had appeared in School Days and were continuing to work regularly with Spike Lee on his subsequent films. Jackson and Nunn were both graduates of Morehouse College in Atlanta, the same historically black institution that Lee had attended, creating an even stronger bond between these collaborators who seemed to move as a unit from one project to another. This casting strategy essentially turned Death by Temptation into an unofficial School Days reunion, with Bond leveraging the relationships and trust he had built during that earlier production to assemble a cast that far exceeded what his budget should have been able to attract. The familiarity and camaraderie between these actors, who had already proven they could work well together, contributed significantly to the natural chemistry that viewers can sense throughout the film. Fact 13. The title makes no linguistic sense. For more than 3 decades, movie fans and critics have been scratching their heads trying to figure out what Death by Temptation actually means as a phrase, and most have concluded that the title simply doesn't work grammatically or logically. The problem stems from the use of deaf, which was popular slang in the late 1980s, meaning excellent or cool, borrowed from hip-hop culture and associated with record labels like Def Jam and comedy shows like Def Comedy Jam. If James Bond III intended deaf to be a stylized spelling of death, then the title would make perfect sense as Death by Temptation, which clearly fits the movie's plot about a succubus who kills men through seduction. However, using the slang version creates the nonsensical phrase excellent by temptation, which has no clear meaning and doesn't describe anything that happens in the film. The confusion deepens when considering that the movie's soundtrack doesn't heavily feature hip-hop music, which would be expected if the title was meant to reference that cultural movement. Instead, the film relies more on rhythm and blues and soul music, making the deaf reference seem even more out of place and disconnected from the actual content. Film critic Verne, who has written extensively about cult cinema, openly admitted his puzzlement with the title, noting that it would make sense if it were something like Death Wish as a play on Death Wish, but Death by Temptation creates a phrase that sounds awkward and means nothing coherent. He rated the title much lower than the actual film, calling it confusing and poorly constructed. This linguistic mystery has persisted throughout the film's cult following, with fans and scholars continuing to debate whether the title represents a simple mistake, a failed attempt at being clever, or some deeper meaning that has been lost to time and cultural context. Fact 14. It featured groundbreaking full frontal male nudity. While horror films of the 1980s and early 90s routinely featured female nudity as a standard element of the genre, Death by Temptation broke new ground by including full frontal male nudity during its most terrifying sequences. This was an extremely uncommon choice for horror filmmakers of the era, who typically avoided showing male victims in states of complete vulnerability and exposure, making James Bond III's decision both bold and memorable for audiences who weren't expecting to see such explicit content. The most striking example occurs during a scene where one of the succubus's victims attempts to flee from her supernatural attacks while completely naked, creating a moment of genuine terror that was amplified by the character's total physical vulnerability. This sequence shocked viewers who caught the film during its cable television broadcasts in the early 1990s, as seeing a terrified man running with full nudity was virtually unprecedented in mainstream horror cinema at that time. The inclusion of male nudity served a specific artistic purpose beyond mere shock value, as it reversed the typical gender dynamics found in most horror films, where female victims were the ones shown in states of undress and helplessness. By putting male characters in this position, Bond created a more equal opportunity approach to vulnerability that treated both male and female characters with the same level of physical exposure during moments of supernatural danger. This creative choice also aligned with the film's broader themes about masculine vulnerability in the face of feminine supernatural power, as the succubus specifically targeted men who thought they were in control of sexual situations, only to discover they were completely powerless against her demonic abilities. The nudity reinforced this power reversal by literally stripping away any pretense of male dominance or protection, leaving the victims as exposed and defenseless as possible during their encounters with evil. Fact 15. The 4-week shooting schedule was impossibly fast. Even experienced Hollywood directors with massive studio support often struggle to complete feature films within reasonable timeframes, which makes James Bond III's achievement with Death by Temptation almost impossible to believe. He managed to shoot his entire debut feature film in just 4 weeks, working with a $5 million budget, while simultaneously handling the demanding responsibilities of starring in the lead role as Joel, the conflicted minister in training at the center of the supernatural story. This breakneck production schedule would be considered extremely ambitious for any filmmaker, but it becomes even more remarkable when considering that Bond was attempting this feat as a complete newcomer to directing. Most first-time directors require significantly more time to work through the technical and creative challenges of bringing their vision to the screen, especially when dealing with complex elements like special effects, multiple locations, and coordinating performances from a cast that included established actors. The 4-week timeline meant that Bond had to maintain an incredibly disciplined approach to every aspect of production, with no room for the typical delays, reshoots, or extended rehearsal periods that most films require. He was essentially learning how to direct while simultaneously delivering a lead performance, managing the overall creative vision, and ensuring that every scene was captured efficiently enough to stay within the compressed schedule. Bond's ability to pull off this ambitious timeline was likely helped by his previous experience working on Spike Lee's School Days, where he had observed professional film production up close and developed relationships with key crew members like cinematographer Ernest Dickerson. However, even with that background, completing a supernatural horror film with multiple practical effects and elaborate set pieces in just 4 weeks represents one of the most efficient, independent film productions of its era, demonstrating remarkable organizational skills and creative focus from a filmmaker who would never direct another movie.